I don't know about you, but quarantine at times can be really tough. But what has been worse has been having no sports and also having to stay at home. A lot of sports fans like myself are searching for some form of entertainment just to watch something to keep us from not being so bored at home. I know last week I caught myself watching marble races on ESPN. Marble races of all things. And though that sounds extremely boring, I was actually really entertained and excited to watch live sport again. If this pandemic did not happen, we would be in the middle of the NBA playoffs right now, which is just always fun to watch. Yet, in its absence of the playoffs, ESPN is doing this series where they play past NBA playoff games so us sports fanatics can just have something to entertain ourselves, even though we know the end of the games, the outcomes, what's going to happen. One of the games I watched the other day was the 2013 NBA Finals between the San Antonio Spurs and the Miami Heat. And if you recall, back then the Miami Heat were known for the big three, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh, who a few years earlier came together to form this super team that people thought were never going to lose a game and be unstoppable. And according to LeBron James, not just win one championship or two or three or four and so on. However, that first season as a team, they struggled to win regular season games, and when they made it to the NBA Finals, they lost to the Dallas Mavericks. Disappointed and embarrassed and also frustrated, going into the offseason, the Heat looked to make moves to better their team. However, instead of signing another superstar, they signed Shane Battier, who in an interview with TED Talk's Adam Grant said that people and other teams around the league were not impressed by the Heat signing just the average role player. Battier was getting older. He wasn't very athletic and he was pretty slow. However, according to Adam Grant, when Battier was on the court, the Heat were more likely to win. And Battier went on to play a key role in the Miami Heat's back-to-back championships the next two seasons. Though Battier was not as athletic as his superstar teammates, he chose to do the dirty work. He watched a ton of film, studied analytics and statistics on opposing players, and did whatever he needed to be for the team. In a team full of superstars and super egos that would not consider to do the same as him. Battier knew what the desired goal of the team was, a championship. Thus, he left his ego at the door and chose to be anything the team needed him to be. Which brings us to our text today in 1 Corinthians 9. Like the Miami Heat, the church in Corinth, which was in one of the largest and most financially important cities in the Roman Empire, not only had a lot of egos, but a ton of problems and debates happening within their congregation. Thus, the first 8 chapters of 1 Corinthians is Paul addressing numerous problems and debates happening in this congregation, including division, Christian wisdom, sexual immorality, lawsuits among believers, and instructions regarding marriage, celibacy, and how we should act to meat, specifically meat sacrificed to idols. However, Paul then transitions from lecturing on about these problems by offering himself as an example of how he does not exercise his rights by eating certain meats or receiving compensation, so he can bring others to the faith and not be a stumbling block to them. Starting in verse 15 in chapter 9, after saying those who preach the gospel, including himself, had the right to have pay, he says in verse 15, "But I have not used any of these rights, and I'm not writing this to the hope that you will do such things for me. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast. Yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I'm compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I'm simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make use of my rights in preaching it. This congregation is filled with Jews, pagans, Gentiles, and Roman citizens, and with that comes a lot of different ideologies, opinions, views, and of course egos of what individuals, members think others and themselves have the right to do in their daily lives. There are also a lot of people, apostles right now in Corinth and in this time that are preaching the gospel just for financial gain and benefit. Though Paul and these other apostles have the right to receive pay, Paul chooses to forego these rights, and in these verses, Paul even boasts about it. However, it's not about his preaching authority that he boasts, but about how valuable it is to go and give up his own rights when preaching the gospel. And that to Paul truly is the reward. Rather than asserting his authority, Paul seeks to humble himself. Now, we may not be posed the same question Paul is, whether or not to accept compensation. And I do not think it is wrong for ministers to do so. However, we each have a question to answer. What rights are you willing to sacrifice, to lose, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Jesus Christ? We continue in chapter 9, starting in verse 19, that says, "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To attain freedom in one's best life in the ancient world was to know oneself and one's existence, and in doing so, control one's fate, to attain the most success or the most comfort, feed and elevate the self. However, Paul goes against Hellenistic thought here and commits social suicide by becoming nothing, by becoming a slave. Paul has the authority and incredible freedom to do what he wants, yet he is compelled and driven by love. A love that is self-emptying, self-denying, and a love that we see on the cross. Are you willing to make yourself a slave to anyone? Rather than asserting what you deserve, are you willing to lose it? In a world that is so focused on the individual and how to gain the most comfort, the most success, Paul is asking, is that really how you want to live this life? Always wanting to have your way? Always doing what you think is right? The most important event in human history was when God, through Jesus Christ, chose not to exert his godliness, but rather in his powerlessness, he sought the lowest position so all could come into relation with him. Christ does not call us to a life of power or of comfort, but one of selflessness. It is not about what I have the right to do, but rather, who do you need me to be in this moment? Paul is giving himself wholly and fully to the needs and service of Christ's mission, and we are challenged to do the same. Therefore, Paul is telling this congregation, yeah, you can eat that piece of meat. You could force others to follow your traditions. You could sleep with all those people, and yeah, you can make all Christians have a certain identity marker and look just like you. But as you do that, let me know how that works out for you, because it is evident so far that it's not going well. But rather than assert your authority, follow the way of the cross. Though challenging, it will lead to an intimacy and a love beyond your comprehension. This shows that our freedom and rights should not be something that's tightly grasped, but should be used to meet people where they are in their spiritual journey. But to be honest, Paul, that's a hard sell. Why give up everything, sacrifice my wants, my desires? And we pick up back in verse 24 where it says, "Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." The UIL, which is an organization that runs all Texas sports and competitions, says that the sport of track and field is not categorized as a team sport, but rather an individual sport. As someone whose main sport in high school was track and field, I believe this assertion is completely wrong. Yes, one can have the mindset of running for themselves, for the self-glory, the self-accolades. And I have to admit, I've had seasons where I've done that. But that doesn't lead to much. However, once I had the realization that I'm just not running for myself, but for a team, and more importantly for my teammates, my drive, my determination, and my focus increased so much more. The scorching hot practices, the long off-season workouts, the running until everything hurt or was numb, made it all worth it seeing my teammates give the same effort and work that much harder alongside me to reach our ultimate goal of being champions. In our individualistic faith society, we can easily see these last few verses as a plea for self-improvement. Rather, this is a call for God's people to seek unity by emptying ourselves of our egos and relying on one another to continue to fulfill Christ's mission in the world, which takes not only self-discipline, but more importantly, a community of believers working together, seeking to serve each other's needs. Therefore, give up everything, sacrifice what you deserve. Well, why? Because knowing the end goal, unity with God, a crown, a joy and a peace that will last forever, is more than enough motivation to stop focusing on the self, but pausing, looking around and seeing around you, though they may be different, your teammates. St. Francis of Assisi says, "Preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words." God is not looking for perfection, but for faithfulness. What would our church communities look like if everyone constantly asked the question, how can I be selfless and serve those around me? Not perfection, because we will all fail. However, what it will lead to is a more unified and strengthened community, because even though we may come up short more times than not, Christ, who perfected selflessness, is our center.